Well, good evening. I'm Keith Luce with the National Committee on North Korea. Welcome. We are so pleased that you could join us this evening with an all-star cast of presenters. I am so honored that Jim Schoff, who is also an NCNK member, and Jim is a senior fellow in the Carnegie Asia program. He will be our moderator this evening. Many of you know Jim. His research focuses on U.S.-Japan relations and regional engagement, East Asia security, and alliance collaboration in high-tech fields. Before joining Carnegie in 2012, Jim served as Senior Advisor for East Asia Policy at the U.S. Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he was responsible for strategic planning and policy development for relations with Japan and the Republic of Korea. So just be aware that this evening's program is being recorded. It will be available later on NCNK's YouTube channel. And at this point, I'm pleased to turn the program now over to Jim, who will introduce our two outstanding guests. Jim, please proceed.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. I appreciate that. And it's always a pleasure to work with National Committee on North Korea, and especially on our topic today, where I get to bring the Japan piece together with Korea and the North Korea dynamic and the North Korean issue. And it's also a real pleasure and honor for me to be joined by two great guests. I'll just jump into the introductions and we'll get started with the discussion. We're joined by Mr. Mitoji Yabunaka, Professor Mitoji Yabunaka, a professor at Mitsumeikan University and Osaka University, which follows a 40-year career in Japan's foreign ministry, where he served as, among other positions, Director General for Asia Affairs, and he was the chief representative for Japan in the six-party talks from 2003. He also completed his career as Vice Foreign Minister, and I always value his views about Japan's foreign policy and the region. And of course, we have Sheila Smith, Dr. Sheila Smith, a senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she specializes on Japanese politics and foreign policy. I truly value my friendship with her. And her most recent book is Japan Rearmed, The Politics of Military Power. And she has a variety of other work that she's been doing, has been following Japan and Japanese politics for many years. So tonight we're going to, or this morning, depending on where you're watching us from, it's tempting to look at North Korea and relations with North Korea as a very static issue, especially Japan-North Korea relations. But I think we've realized from time to time that that's a mistake, and we certainly have a lot of moving parts going on right now with a new administration in Japan, probably a new administration here in the United States coming very soon, and of course coronavirus, changing relations with China, and a lot of other dynamics that we're going to dive into today. So I'm going to ask the panelists a couple of different questions, and we'll get a dialogue and a discussion going here for about a half hour. And then we're going to open it up to everyone who's attending to be able to participate with questions as well. And we're going to get put Keith on the spot in a little while on a couple of issues that he's familiar with. So Yabunaka-san, I'd like to start with you. And at a big picture view, we've heard a lot about how Prime Minister Suga, the new Prime Minister in Japan from a few months ago, will mostly follow the example of former Prime Minister Abe in terms of foreign policy. Perhaps even that Abe himself will be an active advisor for Suga on foreign policy. So before we get into North Korea specifically, in broader terms, is there anything different that you see or different to expect from Suga administration's foreign policy approach in terms of substance, style, or mechanics? And then within that framework, how does policy toward North Korea fit in your view?
Yes, good evening, Jim. Well, actually, good morning here in Kyoto. Thank you very much for introductions. That I think that the Suga administration's Prime Minister Suga is known to be a realist. So of course, the basic policy is to follow up Prime Minister Abe's the policies, and yet you're going to see some sort of differences in his approach. maybe because of two factors. One is his character, as I said, that he's a realist. And Prime Minister Abe was more known to be a very hard-lined conservative group of people backed up the administration. Suga is more sort of neutral in that sense. And number two, that he's sort of very powerful. He has a very powerful coalition in his own the party, Mr. Nikai, who is known to be a kind of good friends of the China or the ROK. And maybe that we're going to have some new developments from this kind of changes. We have already received the ROK, very senior the politicians coming to Japan, and the very interesting talks were carried out. With North Korea, of course, it's not always very easy. I'm also one of those sort of who are responsible for not making very good, sort of effective the policies between two countries. And yet, I hope that the time is running out for many of these families who have become very old. We need a very fast resolutions of the pending issues, and of course, missile and nuclear things. Hope some sort of a new the path will be explored between this new administration and North Korea.
Great, no, thank you. And I want to come back to the South Korea piece because I think that's an interesting dynamic. Mm-hmm. But Sheila, let me talk to you too a little bit about kind of the bigger picture view. And how do you assess the first few months of the Suga administration, the transition from Abe to Suga? What have you noticed about how the Suga administration is kind of shaping up? Are the political underpinnings of the Suga administration different from that of Abe's? And if so, does this have any important implications for Japan's foreign policy approach or relations with the United States, do you think?
Thank you, Jim. Really great questions. And I'm delighted I want to thank Keith and you as well as Yabunaka-san for allowing me to join you in the discussion tonight. I think it's, largely, especially if you sit in Washington, the transition between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Suga was remarkably straightforward and steady. So I think the transition itself has been very calmly handled. And Suga-san, of course, as everyone knows, was the chief cabinet secretary for Mr. Abe for his entire time as prime minister. So Suga-san has been around for much of what Mr. Abe has had put forward as Japan's agenda, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. I think the interesting thing I see on the foreign policy side is that Suga-san very quickly took up the Indo-Pacific mission that Mr. Abe had pulled together and made very clear with Japan's ambition for its relations with the region. And so you saw Suga-san go to Hanoi, conversation in Jakarta, and then he came back and of course he addressed the ASEAN summit virtually. But you see a very obvious first start in the continuity of the Indo-Pacific vision for Mr. Suga, and he's been very clear on that priority. He's also participated in conversations with the United States. President-elect Biden, of course, had a telephone conversation with him. The Prime Minister called Mr. Biden on Sunday after it had been announced here in the United States that Biden had won the election. So President-elect Biden got a congratulatory phone call on Sunday from Prime Minister Suga. But they also, a few days later, President-elect Biden reached out to our Asian allies and of course spoke with the Prime Minister. And in there was no direct reference to North Korea, although there were to other issues we could talk about that are very important to Tokyo. But he also spoke that night, Biden spoke that night to South Korea. So I can come back to that as well. I think in terms of the domestic politics, and I'll be very brief here, Jim, I think Prime Minister Suga has a different foundation of support in Japan. And as Japan watchers know, there's a lower house election expected sometime between now and next fall. So there will be a lower house election and Suga will have to lead his party into that election. And so, carrying the weight of the COVID pandemic and the economic repercussions of that, this will be a big election for the LDP. And I'm not sure yet if there will be others in the LDP that will want to contest his time in the chair as prime minister or not. So we'll have to stay and watch that story unfold. He's not Mr. Abe in that sense. He doesn't have the same strength and coalition. But I think it's going to be interesting to watch him navigate the next year to see how he builds popular support in addition to continuing to garner LDP support for his leadership.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Well, let's drill down more specifically onto North Korea and North Korea policy. So I've been getting ready for tonight and looking at the various statements and developments in Japan vis-a-vis North Korea. And on the one hand, there's a lot that's familiar. Early on, Chief Cabinet Secretary Kato issued some very familiar statements about the importance of resolving the abductee issue, a top priority, he called it. Criticism of North Korea's unacceptable assertions that the issue was fully resolved. And I saw in the paper just a little while ago, a day or two ago, that Chief Cabinet Secretary Kato had recorded a radio message for abductees in North Korea, essentially to tell them, don't worry, we haven't forgotten about you. We're doing everything we can to get you back. But if Suga is a realist, there's a real question about how realistic is it that there really are abductees left in North Korea who could possibly return. We've also seen some other interesting dynamics. We have the Olympics coming up now. The Olympics in the recent past were a catalyst for diplomacy with North Korea. Certainly President Moon is anxious to try to do that again. And as you mentioned, Yabunaka-san, this diplomacy between Japan and South Korea certainly seems to be active. So do you see any evolution of Japan's North Korea policy approach, even thinking back from your time in government to the recent past to today, in terms of substance or strategy?
Yes, the point here is that the abduction issue is so strong among Japanese people that the old stories like Megumi Yokota, who was kidnapped at the age of 12, happened in 1977, so already 43 years have passed. And her family, Mr. and Mrs. Yokota, so sort of persuasive to Japanese people, public, not just Japanese people, but American presidents also moved very heavily by all kinds of sort of very sad stories, awful stories, that she's been kidnapped at the age of 12, detained there over so many years. So one point, clear point, is that of course this is politically very strong, high sort of the issue also for Suga administrations. And my advice to North Korea is that they have to come to terms with truth. Truth matters. And so far that what they said to us, that eight abductees are dead, there's no grounds, awful sort of and groundless sort of explanations. Nobody can believe in that matters. So certainly that all abductees must come home, Japan, very soon, rapidly, soon. And yet the first thing that they have to do is come to terms with truth. And they have shown the more credible evidences, whatever. And that's the first sort of point. And that those abductees come home. That's the beginning. But at the same time, as you might notice, Prime Minister Suga mentioned that without any condition is ready to meet with Mr. Kim Jong Un. And also, as you said, the occasion, the Olympics next year, hopefully that Olympics and Paralympics will be held. Depends on many of things, including in particular that the pandemics, and people are not so quite sure about that. But yet, the message is that why not, if that kind of things happen, meaning that Mr. Kim Jong Un come to Japan to celebrate this Olympics and Paralympics, why not? This should be a good opportunity to meet. That's a message. So message is clearly being thrown to North Korea. Why not work together? And I hope that they will listen to that very straightforward message.
Yeah, it was interesting. I noticed just the other day or yesterday, the EU sponsored a declaration or what would I call it? Resolution at the United Nations criticizing North Korean human rights conditions. I guess this is the 16th time or so that this has been done, but only the second time that Japan was not a co-sponsor, or Japan was not a co-sponsor last year and also did not co-sponsor this year. So that could be something that could be considered to be opening up. And then there was, just to give people the background, a report out of the Korean press that Japan was preparing or open to offering an invitation to Kim Jong Un to visit Japan for the Olympics, but a senior diplomat in Japan disavowed that or said that wasn't true necessarily. So there is some movement going on. Sheila, let me ask you then, kind of, let's bring the U.S. into this a little bit. I know you're not a U.S. political specialist, but you live here in Washington. We breathe it every day. And all of this diplomacy and North Korea policy and engagement is going to take place in a backdrop of a U.S.-North Korea dynamic that's going on. So I wonder if you think what this new Biden administration might mean for U.S. policy vis-a-vis Japan and North Korea. Certainly Biden's style is going to be different than Trump's, but can the policy approach be much different?
So I think, Jim, and of course, we all know that transitions give opportunity. It opens the door a little bit to reset the diplomacy. And I wouldn't say that I know what the a Biden administration will do on North Korea. I think everybody's holding their breath, first and foremost, to see what North Korea might do during the transition, right? To complicate the conversation or to draw attention to their point of view. I do think, during the campaign, there were some comments made by then candidate Biden or his team. And in some ways they were speaking to the Trump presidency's approach. And I think there's a kind of cold shoulder to the kind of high level meetings, right? The president meeting Kim Jong Un, and a little bit more of this sense that sanctions haven't worked yet. We're not where we want to be. We need to get where we want to be. So you heard that language a little bit in the campaign to distinguish then candidate Biden from President Trump and his team. I think this is a team that's quite seasoned, but I don't know that I've heard a lot from the President-elect Biden yet on what the strategy might be. And I do believe, and Jim, you should jump in on this because you know as much as I do about this, is that there will be a focused conversation with President Moon, obviously, about how to proceed. And you saw in the congratulatory phone call, or the phone call that followed up the congratulations last week, right, that there was a reference to looking forward to discussing North Korea, among other things, right? So I do think we're going to start. I would expect the Biden administration to start with a conversation with President Moon, but I don't think the conversation with Japan is going to be all that far behind. The question, I guess, for the region and for Japan and South Korea is whether or not there's a way to work together on how this diplomacy, and especially the diplomacy about the United States, works its way through. And I defer to those who are in Japan, because they know better than I how much receptivity there might be to a new conversation between Seoul and Tokyo on some of these issues. But Yabunaka-san, of course, has been in the midst of this for some time. But I don't see yet that, to my eyes, that there's a clear strategy. I think there's a wait and see, and I'm sure there's a very strong internal conversation among the transition team about what to do if. And that can be, the range of ifs could be provocations from North Korea and run all the way through perhaps a potential diplomatic opportunity to reset after the Trump administration. That's my guess about where we are.
Jim, may I add a few comments on that matter?
Please.
For the new new President-elect Biden administrations. That surprisingly or not for you, Mr. Trump is very popular in Japan. And they say, well, Abe, Trump, such a good friendship. And well, there's no problem between Japan and the United States. I kept saying that, well, under President Trump, America-centered international cooperation system we have nurtured for so many years is in jeopardy. But people don't listen too much of that kind of comment. But now, and also people concerned that the democratic president and Japan are more difficult to manage. So this is a great and very pleasant surprise in that phone conversation, Mr. New Prime Minister Suga and the President-elect Mr. Biden, that President-elect Biden said that the Senkaku Island will be covered by Japan-US security treaty. And that's the big sort of surprise. Oh, look, the new administration and Japan could go very well, smoothly, more smoothly than we had anticipated. That is what is happening.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I do think clearly from the Biden administration, you will see a strong commitment to the alliances and to a consultative process on a variety of things. I mean, I think that's how they view, that's what they see as the path toward dealing with long-term strategic competition with China and dealing with the North Korean challenge. Let's a question kind of open to both of you, if you'd like to respond. We haven't talked about China yet. A little bit about South Korea, but we could talk more about that. The United Nations we mentioned in terms of the statement there. What about these other players from a Japanese perspective? How could potentially a Suga and Biden administration leverage or coordinate their policy with these other players vis-a-vis North Korea to get the best possible outcome?
Yes, on North Korea, that as one of the founding fathers, if you will, of the Six Parties talks, I'm of course naturally inclined to resume that kind of sort of multilateral approach to meet with the North Korean nuclear missile threat. Leaving to just Americans and the North Koreans, what happened in Singapore, 2018, seen from my eyes, nothing really in terms of denuclearization. So long as Mr. Trump is concerned, and the commitment on the part of Kim Jong Un not to go for ICBM test is satisfactory. So day after that meeting, there's any more sort of a nuclear threat from North Korea. But for us, for Japan, it is not. That sort of simple case. We have to work for denuclearization, good game plan. And for that matters, looks like the Hanoi meeting, they didn't have any kind of in advance preparations. And although North Korea may be intended to put all sorts of the nuclear facilities in Yongbyon on the table, meaning that that's pretty substantial, could be a new start for the negotiations. But you need a good game plan. And naturally that the goal is denuclearization. And there are certainly that are okay, but in particular China. We have to work together with China for that matters to make it happen. That's my understanding.
Hmm. Sheila, any thoughts on that front?
Sure. I think that we've gone through, and Jim, you've written about this extensively, so I hate to be the one to be speaking on this issue, but we've gone through a whole series of approaches that we've tried negotiations with Pyongyang to try to persuade them, entice them, right, to move away from their nuclear path. I think we're pretty sure that we're on the cusp, right, of a nation that is a nuclear power. The question now is, how can we dissuade them? Can we use the same mechanisms as we did before? What incentives may we offer, and what disincentives can we offer? And I think it's just a more difficult problem today than it was, for example, during the time when Bill Perry began the examination with our allies about how can we work together to dissuade North Korea from going down this route. So we've got a long history here in which the North has really acquired capabilities that threaten the security and safety of our allies in new and much, much more problematic ways. And in fact, of course, we worry about the ICBM, the ability for the North Koreans now to reach out and touch us as well. So I think it's a more difficult game now. It's a far more difficult political environment in the region. So I'm referencing here, and I hope Yabunaka Sensei will contribute here, but the South Korean-Japan relationship is not as easy to get on the same page as even as it was or may have been in 2017. So we're looking at several degrees of complexity here that I think is going to be, it's going to require focused and consistent attention among the United States and its allies in the region, Japan first and foremost, but obviously also South Korea. And I think deterrence is also part of the picture. I tend to not, put the military piece first, but clearly the deterrent requirements of our two alliances in Northeast Asia are being affected deeply by the acquisition of capability by North Korea. So there's both the diplomatic piece, which is what your question was really addressing, but then there's also the question of whether we can, together with South Korea and Japan, whether we can deter aggression in the same way should North Korea really be capable of an ICBM that can threaten us, as opposed to just being able to threaten or being able to severely threaten its neighbors in the region. So it's more complicated than it's ever been. And I think we're going to have to really put our best minds and people, such as Yabunaka-san, to the test here, because I think this is going to be a very complicated problem for the next president and his administration to try to solve.
Yeah, I totally agree on the complexity dynamic, and I'm a little worried because we have a few strikes against us on that front in terms of being able to manage that. It was already hard enough when the United States was kind of a sole superpower in the world, and we had all those strengths going on when at times we had really good trilateral cooperation and in the Japan, Korea, South Korea relations. Now we have real tension on the Japan-South Korea front. We have a very distracted United States in a political sense, divided political budget deficits, et cetera. And I think we could come up with something that's a kind of a 2-4-6 dynamic where you really have the inter-Korean dialogue going, a 4-party talk kind of piece to it, and then a 6-party talk piece adding Japan and Russia. But managing that, providing leadership to that and coordination for that is a very difficult challenge. But that's the kind of challenge that we have in where North Korea is. Along this line, I want to ask kind of a final question before we begin, before I turn to Keith, and then we begin opening it up. And I'm going to jump to the last question that I had planned here, because it gets at this issue of deterrence and where North Korea ranks on Japan's foreign policy list of priorities and security list of priorities. And I know that China looms very large on the strategic landscape in Asia, especially viewed from Tokyo. But I can't help but feel sometimes that Japan underestimates the strategic importance of the North Korean military or nuclear challenge. It's an unpredictable, at times aggressive actor, able to launch a nuclear attack against Japan with virtually no warning. Meanwhile, Japan's foreign policy approach has been at times a little bit proactive, but primarily passive, unchanging, despite these North Korean military improvements, cyber attacks and the like. So why is North Korea not a more prominent and divisive subject of debate in Japanese foreign policy circles or among the voting public? Or am I viewing that incorrectly? And so to that, I have to kind of turn to Yabunaka-san for.
Okay, Jim, I understand it. That even 2003, when I was making a first opening statement for 6-party talks, all the interest and concern of the Japanese press is whether I touch on abduction issues. And the other countries say, oh, this is time to talk about the nuclear and missile. But I have to say that. I have to convince my colleagues, Mr. Wang Yi, who was the chairman at the time, that for North Korea to forget about and give up the nuclear arsenals, 2 things. One is security assurances. This is particularly from the United States. The other part is economic cooperations or assistance. And that Japan can play a big role. But for that to happen, certainly not only the nuclear, but also abduction issues must be resolved. So abduction issue for us is really clearly closely connected to the North Koreans forgetting about giving up the nuclear arsenals. That was the message at that time. Today, how I see it, certainly the Japan-US security alliance is a very rich foundation. But at the same time, this month, Mr. Wang is coming to Japan, a foreign minister of China. You're going to see some sort of new start or more sort of closely consulted the conversations among these regions. And as to North Korea, one thing that you have to also understand is it is really a serious issue politically as well as sort of security concern. And when the Aegis Ashore the program came up, and which didn't go very well, and all of a sudden in the last few months, the discussion in Japan, in particular among the ruling party, is that we have to have some sort of a strike capability, not just waiting for the missiles coming down to Japan and to counterattack that matters for defensive purposes. We should have some kind of strike capability against the enemy bases, meaning that the North Korea. That tells us that people are concerned about the nuclear missiles. I say rather publicly that this doesn't work out very well, because we can't have any kind of in advance information or intelligence when North Korea is going to launch missiles type of things. But nonetheless, I'm very surprised that more than 50% of the Japanese public support that kind of idea that Japan should have a strike capabilities, meaning that North Korea in many ways are very much a concern for us, including security areas. And people do also understand that kind of sort of sentiment in Japan.
Oh, thank you. Well, we'll have to keep, everything's a priority, right? You have to kind of keep dealing with South China Sea, East China Sea, and North Korea at the same time.
Right.
Keith, if I can, I'd like to begin bringing you into this discussion and to put you on the spot a little bit, but I'll let you pick which spot you want to tackle. You have a lot of experience in Congress, working at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so I'm kind of curious how a Republican-led Congress, a Senate, how important that is to North Korea policy to some extent, or how you see the congressional role. Some of the things that maybe Biden would want to do, he has to do within the context of that constraint, perhaps. And then also with your work with National Committee on North Korea, you work with a lot of organizations that are on the ground, grassroots groups providing aid and other engagement vis-a-vis North Korea, health care and other things and the like. And you've worked with the current administration on trying to facilitate some of that. So I wonder if you can add a little bit of the flavor of that, how that plays in possibly in a US-Japan context, or to comment on anything else that you've heard so far.
Well, thank you, Jim. From the North Korean angle, they are bound to be wondering if the Republicans in the Senate will provide the same amount of space to President Biden as they did to President Trump on North Korea policy. There was silence largely. There was this element of trust on the part of Republicans. Mr. Trump, personal opinion, was able to achieve certain things that would have been very difficult for a Democrat to do if he or she were in the White House and expect Republican support. But it's also important that President-elect Biden, once he's in office, that he brings the Congress in early. And the degree to which he brings the Congress in will be a reassurance to North Korea that if in fact there ever is a deal or an agreement of any sort, that the Congress is at least aware and more likely to support that. But back to the Japan angle here, within the Congress, there is strong bipartisan support for Japan-US relations, not only in the context of the alliance and security issues, but there's also recognition of the amazing number of points of intersection between Japan and the United States on other fronts. According to the East-West Center, over 800,000 jobs in the US today were directly created by Japanese companies in the US. Another 700,000 plus jobs in the US were created indirectly by Japanese companies. This is quite significant. And I think that this fact is lost on many Americans. But having said that, the abduction issue is also a matter of interest to the Congress. Over the years, families of abductees from Japan have been regular in visiting the Congress, in reminding the Congress about this very sad and tragic part of history. There's also interest in the Congress based upon the disappearance of an American by the name of David Sneddon, who disappeared in 2004 from China. Sneddon, he's from Utah, he was a student. Mr. Sneddon's family is of the opinion, and others, that he was abducted, taken into North Korea. I don't know, this is yet to be verified. However, this is also, this report, this possibility, has also gotten the attention of people in Japan and the Japanese government. And I know the embassy in the past has communicated with the Sneddon family, with the Congress. So this is another point of intersection as relates to congressional interest in the abductee issue. And I must say that Japanese leaders and Prime Minister Abe in particular really are to be commended for their persistence on this project, on this issue. And, you know, the abduction of citizens by North Korea was not been restricted to Japan. It was not restricted to Japan. There were people abducted from Macau, from Hong Kong, from a number of other places. Indeed, the number of Japanese citizens far exceeds those taken or citizens from any other country. But for leaders in Japan, let me just conclude this part by saying, I think in the Congress, there's a recognition that the leaders of Japan are in a tough spot with North Korea. On one hand, there is this abduction issue. It's real. It's a matter of concern to the Japanese people. They want their fellow citizens returned. But on the other hand, if you are a leader in Japan, you know that North Korean missiles are aimed at you. And so as you work with North Korea, you try to reconcile, come to an agreement involving all of this. That is very difficult. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And you know, you touched on an area that I was also going to try to ask about, and maybe I could squeeze it in briefly, because I can't help but think sometimes, even though they're different situations, apples and oranges to some extent, to a large extent perhaps, the United States pursued a reconciliation with Vietnam and normalizing relations with Vietnam, despite a very emotional, widespread, felt issue of POWs, prisoners of war missing in action, and a need to put that resolution of that issue up front before progress could be made on the other. And eventually, I think they were put on some kind of parallel track, that the issue was not forgotten and left alone, and it needed to be addressed sincerely, but that it didn't have to be completely solved before the normalization process could go forward. Is that something that you think either of you, from a Japanese political perspective, is possible, or is it going to continue to be this upfront resolution first before things can really move?
Yeah, if I may, Jim, and I appreciate very much the keys you're saying, that there's bipartisan support on the Hill on these abduction issues. And we appreciate very much for that matters. I mean, we mean Japanese people are very much appreciative of the US Congress's interest and the very sympathetic views on these issues. At the same time, of course, we have to tackle in a comprehensive, very complex issues. On one hand, certainly that this abduction issues. On the other hand, there's missile and the nuclear issues of this security concerns. And that's the reason why that the message from Mr. Suga and the new cabinet is that, yes, he's ready to meet without any condition. Meaning that we're not saying that unless this issue be resolved, we can't go anything. That's not the message. We are, I think, in my understanding, the new administrations also keep sending message. We are ready to talk in a comprehensive manner without any conditions. And I certainly believe that while Mr. Abe sending the same messages, as I said, there are kind of strong reservations because of a previous sort of postures on sanctions after sanctions. This sort of new administrations, I think that those Koreans have to take this opportunity very seriously. And I know, and you know, their economic conditions are so bad, awful. So there may be the chances where that we can move forward in resolving in a very comprehensive manner. I hope so.
Sheila.
So just a couple of comments here, I think, especially for those of us in the United States that follow this, particularly as Keith says from the Hill. There's been an evolution, of course, in Japan's position. It's not that Japan has simply had a hard line on the abductees and has been compromised. And in the beginning years of the Abe cabinet, of course, there was outreach to Pyongyang. And there was Kim Jong Un's basically setting up a new commission to talk to the Japanese about it, right? So there were overtures and there were efforts. So it's not as if there hasn't been intermittent attempts to have a conversation to try to explore what North Korea is ready to do in terms of providing information. And the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Yabunaka-san particularly, and others, but also the Japanese police have dossiers that they shared with their North Korean counterparts. There's, there's a series of kinds of questions that the Japanese have about the whereabouts, not just about the 17 abductees for which there is concrete evidence of kidnapping, right? But there's also hundreds of other cases, right? Where there's circumstantial evidence that this could have been somehow people missing who could have, fallen into the same fate, right, as the people who have been documented. And then, of course, the history is important here. In the 1960s, many Japanese married people of Korean ancestry who then went back to North Korea. And there's a question about whether those people would like to be repatriated or not. So there's a series of questions. And I think, Kim Jong Un can be cooperative in trying to answer the series of questions. And I think his government just really has not been. So I think it's important to remember there's been multiple times to have a serious conversation about the whereabouts of the Japanese. And it's a complex one, as you know. It's not just Japanese stubbornness. So I'm going to put it bluntly here. But here's the other thing that I don't understand from Kim Jong Un's point of view. Is in the recent diplomacy, including his outreach to President Trump and the United States, and then to Xi Jinping and to others, this most recent effort by Kim Jong Un to say, I want to engage, I want a different relationship. President Moon, we want a more peaceful reconciliation. He completely cold-shouldered Japan. He did not respond. And Abe-san was quite forthright to say, no conditions based, I would like to also have a conversation. So North Korea has also communicated to Japan in ways that have not been helpful. And I think that's where the opportunity lies there. There has to be not only Japan-South Korea dialogue, Japan-United States dialogue, Japan-China dialogue for that matter, but North Korea has to have a serious conversation, has to be willing to have a serious conversation. I'll just tie it up here, Jim, so you can move on to question and answers. But I think it's very important for an American audience to understand that in 2017, when Kim Jong Un was testing short, medium, and then the ICBM missiles, they were all in the direction of Japanese territory. Some landed in Japanese EEZs. Some, of course, the ICBMs later in the year were, basically to demonstrate they had the capacity to go through or over or into Japanese airspace. So there's a little bit of brinksmanship going on between in Pyongyang to illustrate Japanese vulnerability to North Korea's increasing military capability. And that's something for American policymakers we have to be absolutely clear about. That the US-Japan alliance is the mechanism by which Japan can respond to this implicit set of threats. So there's a complicated picture here. And I worry sometimes when we talk about the abductee problem, it's complicated enough that we say, okay, can't we find a compromise? But you have to look at the entire North Korea-Japan relationship in the context of the regional dialogue. North Korea has made choices that have really made it difficult for Japan to be able to have a constructive engagement. And I think that's just a context there.
Yeah, no, those are very good points. And it's a good lead in. So we have one question from John Merrill, for example, on this question of diplomacy and outreach. Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi said Monday that Tokyo is maintaining dialogue with North Korea. Can we elaborate? What do we think maintaining dialogue with North Korea means? Yabunaka-san, do you have an opinion?
Of course, theoretically, that there are several sort of the paths or channels that we should explore. One, of course, in Beijing, there's a diplomatic sort of channels there. But on top of that, I'm sure that if Motegi-san, the foreign minister, is saying there are some other channels he's hinting to that matters. There has been, and I hope that there is today, which I'm not quite sure, any substance, any kind of substantive and the dialogue taking place or not. I'm not quite sure. So that's the reason why I keep saying that North Korea should take advantage of this kind of a new opening, as Sheila mentioned, that they must act now. And so it is always, as you know, that any kind of channels, you need a kind of willingness to take advantage of matters. And this time we have shown some readiness to work with North Korea. And that's the reason why that they should take this chance and to go for it. There are several sort of available channels if they decide to use it. That's my understanding.
Yeah, okay. So Lee Siegel has a question that I think we've kind of already answered. I may skip it, but just to let you know, and we could come back to it if we have time, but he asks if Prime Minister Suga is willing to take a much more flexible stance with the negotiation process with North Korea in terms of not resisting efforts to negotiate the Korean nuclear issue. He's alluding to possibly that Abe was an obstacle in that regard. But you've talked already a little bit, Yabunaka-san, about the difference of Suga and kind of the openness. I don't get the sense that you would see him as opposing efforts of a Biden effort to negotiate with a nuclear issue with North Korea, do you?
Well, two things. One is that, as I said, that there's new chances, meaning that, North Korea tend to have a kind of long memories, and memories about Abe. So whatever Prime Minister Abe said, that he was also ready, he said, to meet with Kim Jong Un, but because of maybe, and that's as I suspect, because of sort of long memories that before Singapore summit meetings, Abe kept saying that the pressure after pressure type of things. So that's the reason why that I say they should take advantage of this new administration coming in Japan. Certainly, Prime Minister Suga and from Prince Abe's positions are not too different. Well, I should say same, but nonetheless, they can have a more sort of open-minded approach to that matters. Second is that, of course, the US president and administration may take a much more sort of a broader approach involving the allies and other friends, and if necessary, China as well, type of things to deal with North Korea. So we can have a more sort of a comprehensive approach to North Korea on that front, including both, as Sheila mentioned, we can offer to North Korea. And certainly that the security assurance, economic considerations. But for them to give up the nuclear matters, we have to have a very good sort of well-planned the strategy to work out with North Korea. I hope it will take place also.
Yeah, and of course, Sheila, as you alluded to, I mean, I think a Biden administration would be much more reassuring to Tokyo than Trump was in the context of keeping them informed, keeping them kind of in the loop. I mean, I think that was part of Abe's concern was you had off-the-cuff cancellation of military exercises on the Korean Peninsula and things that were not vetted in advance. So that could be part of it as well. I have a question from Mark Tokola. How can the US, Japan, and South Korea credibly establish deterrence toward North Korea without irritating China? China claimed to believe THAAD was all about them, for example. How does that work?
And
Sheila, go ahead. I'll let Sheila go first here.
Yeah,
I'm
you
sure
put the
I can
deterrence.
say things that Yabunaka-san probably maybe can't. Clearly, the first piece of homework is the Japan-ROK relationship, and I'll just be a little blunt here. And I think, without, since 2017, when we watched the two alliances, as Mark knows well, align themselves, calibrate exercises to signal to the North, right? I mean, there wasn't an integration of the three, but there was a real parallel effort to speak to Pyongyang in one voice. And you saw it in demonstrated capabilities, you saw it in exercises, you saw it in, you know, high-level political statements. So I think the alliances are in sync when the threat from North Korea is very conspicuous and very present. But what's happened since 2017, of course, and Yabunaka can say more about this, obviously, than I can, is that the bilateral Seoul-Tokyo relationship, of course, has been far more fraught and largely over you know, the Supreme Court cases over the forced labor issue. And I think, you know, somewhere in there, the United States has some influence, but really doesn't have other influence. And so the bilateral Seoul-Tokyo piece, I think, is one of the most important, I would say, one of the most important pieces of how do we get back to a strong deterrent, because it's not about demonstrating military capability, right? It's about aligning ourselves, and here I would include the United States, on what do we do about this far more reckless but militarily lethal state in North Korea. How do we negotiate? How do we try to negotiate? But how do we also make sure to deter aggression when we have a much, much more militarily powerful country now in the North? So I think there's a lot of alliance questions here, but I think the political piece of the puzzle for me still comes back to how do we manage Tokyo and Seoul to get back to a position where we can actually talk openly about what is possible in terms of alliance cooperation.
Well, and I almost think, I mean, that's a good point. And it's almost counterintuitive too, because we usually talk about, oh, trilateral cooperation is easier on the security front when it's focused on North Korea, as opposed to in other areas, missile defense cooperation, this and that. But those are the kinds of things that make China nervous in the context of alliance strengthening. A non-threatening alliance strengthening, you know, having Suga and Moon just hugging each other, playing golf, where they're just perceived as close, and the countries are close economically and diplomatically, but not necessarily militarily. That's almost better, right?
So call me old-fashioned, Jim. I wouldn't mind a little bit of alliance unity, even if it makes China somewhat upset.
Well, that's true. Our job is not to make China feel comfortable.
I'm not trying to make China upset, but I think the alliance unity piece, I would be willing to sacrifice just a few ripples for the alliance unity.
Good point. Good point. Keith, can I ask you a quick question on your perception of the view from North Korea to all this? We hear conflicting views about North Korea is totally fine, stable, everything's okay, things are improving. But then there's also all the natural disasters they went through. The sanctions are still there. The pandemic is maybe there, maybe not there. How prepared, or what's the situation from North Korea's perspective in terms of their ability to be a partner in all of this, do you think?
Well, you've asked the million-dollar question. It gets down to COVID, right? As you're aware, once COVID was detected in China, Kim Jong Un shut down the borders. The quarantine measures that he implemented, and which remain in place to this day, have had a tremendous impact on disrupting supply chains. Humanitarian workers cannot get into the country. No one can get into the country. Not only can no one get into the country, but if in fact you work for the United Nations in Pyongyang, or an NGO, or a foreign embassy, and if you depart, North Korea will not allow your position to be filled by someone else. It is conceivable that by January 1, United Nations operations in North Korea may be down to 2 people. So whether it be totally connected to COVID or not, North Korea is fully taking advantage of the situation to expel expats, to rid the country of international folks. North Korea is also insisting that visitors will not be able to come in until a vaccine has been developed and the citizens of North Korea have had access to that vaccine. So the question then becomes, well, what about in the interim? What about the people in the countryside? What about the neediest of North Korea's citizens? What about those who have compromised health system, personal health situations? So it is a very challenging picture, and one where it's where we can talk today about what the Biden administration might do or what Japan may be able to do with North Korea. But ultimately, in terms of aid going in from the outside, right now, North Korea is restricting it largely to China. China is stepping up in a big way to support North Korea, not only COVID specific, but in terms of other forms of aid. Russia is as well. And so Kim Jong Un at the moment, for months now, they've rejected any offers of COVID-19 help from the United States. In addition to that, there are literally thousands of containers sitting on the China side of the border waiting to go into North Korea, which have been prevented from doing so because of concern about COVID. So Jim, in some shape or form, there's no doubt that what COVID is going to be a major factor on not only North Korea's future, but how North Korea will in fact interact with the neighborhood aside from China and from Russia. I would imagine that they're taking notes of Prime Minister Suga's offers, but they've also taken notes of South Korea's offers, right? And to this point have been unwilling for the most part to accept help from the ROK.
Jim, one word, if I may, to
Yes.
add to Japan ROK relations, and of course, the key to counter the North Korean nuclear threat and all kinds of sort of regional difficult issues, a good sort of a partnership among the allies and also friends, which means that, of course, Japan-US alliance, but also that Japan, US, and ROK, the good communications and deterrence is very important to meet with those sort of challenges from North Korea or otherwise. And what we saw between Japan and ROK for the last several years is that, of course, for Japanese people, they're fed up with all kinds of sort of continuous the movement by North Korea to go back to all kinds of sort of the developments, including that wartime workers problems, which should have been resolved at the time of 1965. We have a basic treaty to cover everything, so both sides gave up all kinds of the claims for the past. And of course, Japan provided $500 million for economic cooperation for that matters. That should have resolved everything. I kept saying to Japanese people that we should understand the sentiment of Korean people, but nonetheless, at the same time that this kind of state to state or country to country, the relations should be governed by the treaty commitment to otherwise. And the one sort of a way out, what I saw it in this recent weeks, is some kind of communications start taking places between ROK and Japan. And we can go back to what is called the export control measures that the South Korea thought they hit very hard by this kind of other issues, but other political issues. That's their understanding. I think that there are rules and there are ways to resolve that issues that keep asking South Koreans to have a better arrangement for export control measures. And then we can go back to where it was. And that's a good starting point. Of course, saying to the Koreans that there are red lines to make it check and cashing all kinds of the previous claims with regard to the workers' problems. They should not do that. At the same time, we can resolve those issues, and in doing so, we can move forward. And that will stabilize relations, and we can start talking more effectively. We used to have a TCOC consultation, Japan, US, ROK. It isn't anymore, but we can go back to that part. And also China, that we keep saying that yes, a free and open Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific Ocean is very important, but we don't mean that this is a containing policy against China. And Mr. Wang is coming to Japan. We'll have a better understanding for that matters. And you have already seen that the RCEP and the trade opening measures among the 16 countries, except for India couldn't join us, so 15 countries have just come into force or come to agreement for that matter. So many things are now start happening. And I hope that some more positive things will take place in these regions. And Japan can have a more, in a sense, aggressive peace offensive to make sure that this kind of regions will be stabilized.
Terrific, thank you. Sheila, any final thoughts? We're at the end of our time, but I want to give you a final chance.
We typically sit here, Jim, and you've written about this extensively. Keith has written about this extensively. But we think of our alliances in Northeast Asia with Japan and with South Korea as one of the main vehicles for problem solving. And I think I would like to see us try to go back in the Biden administration to playing a constructive role in rebuilding that framework, not necessarily as a military first kind of alliance. But as Keith is pointing out, COVID-19 is creating all kinds of transformations that are sort of under the surface of how we normally talk about Japan, North Korea, or Japan, South Korea, or US in the region. And I think there's a lot of latitude there for looking at what's happening on the ground and finding ways that Japan, the United States, and Korea can work together to respond to the tragedy of COVID, obviously, but also to be preventive and moving forward. And we can build coalitions that will be helpful for all of us in the future. So I think there may be a creative moment here in our diplomacy, that it doesn't push us back into the Japan, South Korea, North Korea. How do we make this work? But I think we can have some constructive engagement, I think, on broader problem solving. That in the end Keith will probably call me optimistic, but can maybe help us also in our dialogue with North Korea.
Terrific. Yeah. Listening to Yabunaka-san and Sheila talk about these final comments, especially, all I could think of was, could we be on the cusp or I guess what we need to do is try to be on the cusp of a renaissance of diplomacy in the region. And that certainly, as the Biden administration looks to rebuild and reconstitute the State Department, for example, and rebalance American foreign policy in a variety of ways, there's perhaps an opportunity for that. It's certainly one we ought to pursue. So we haven't completely solved it all, but I feel as if we understand a lot better where Japan is right now and its thinking on foreign policy, and North Korea and the region, and the United States as well, a little bit. And I just want to thank Keith for the opportunity to do this, and Esther, who helped put it all together from NCNK, and to Sheila and Yabunaka-san for your time and input, and to the whole audience for participating today. Didn't get to all the questions, but we had some good ones. And I think I have to leave it there. Keith, sure, I can't get you to say any final word?
Well, I would just like to say thanks, Jim, not only to you, but to Professor Yabunaka and to Sheila. It's been a great panel, and thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening and this morning.
Great. So with that, I will bid you all farewell for the moment, and I hope we...
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.